Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our look at the 50 greatest historical events that never happened from Sideprojects. A lot of great comments from yesterday, and I want to just say a couple of things real quick up front. Anytime if you notice me saying something, you're like, man, I'm not sure if that's right, or I don't know if he misspoke or if he's just wrong about that, please always check for the pinned comment on that video, because I'm doing these reactions kind of off the top of my head. I don't have notes. I don't watch them ahead of time. So occasionally I do misspeak. I remember something wrong, something that needs corrected later. And if there is a correction to be made, I will pin a comment, either a comment from somebody else or a comment that I type. So for yesterday, perfect example, what I meant to say when I was talking about scientists who were Christians, I meant to say Isaac Newton. Some of you figured that out, that that's what I meant. But I said Einstein, who was definitely not a Christian. He was Jewish. So I pinned that comment, even though a lot of other people continued to comment about it. So just always check the pinned comments, which will be right at the top of the comment section, because you might see corrections there, even if you're not looking for one. So that's one thing. Number 2, part 1 of my reaction to this is in the description if you didn't see part 1. We'll see how far we get today. I'm guessing we'll probably do a third of it again. And I also want to give a congratulations to Ipswich on their promotion to the Premier League in England. I'm not actually an Ipswich fan. I love their jersey, which is why I have one. But my friend Paul Woodage from World War II TV is an Ipswich fan, so I'm very happy for him and for Ed Sheeran and for all of those who support that team for back-to-back promotions all the way from League One to the Premier League. Hopefully they can stay, and hopefully my West Brom won't be far behind if they can win a couple playoff games. So we'll see. The last thing before we go ahead and dive into this video today is new content, new original content up on Stories of the Great War. Every video that I post has a link in the description to that channel, Stories of the Great War. It's all original content on that channel based on World War I, most of it on site. So this was a video I did from a place called Mamet Wood on the Somme battlefield that I shot last summer, talking about the Welsh division attack, an attack in which they lost 4,000 men in 5 days. So check that out if you would. I'm very proud of how that video came out. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Of touch the ruling class were with the people over.
This is the end of the previous one.
Ruling. Martin Luther's 95 Theses. On October the 31st, 1517, Martin Luther walked to the doors of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church. It was a bold act of defiance that kicked off the Reformation and Luther's split from the Catholic Church. At least, that was what we've been led to believe. But it didn't quite go down like that. It is believed that Luther never nailed his theses to the church doors. He simply mailed them to the archbishop. Luther was a priest and a devout Catholic, and he wasn't looking to form his own religion, just to fix the church.
People forget that part. Martin Luther, I think, first of all, would probably be horrified that there is something called the Lutheran Church today. I don't know, maybe not. But he wasn't looking to start a Protestant Reformation. He was looking to fix what he saw as things that were wrong with the existing church. He didn't want the church to split. And as is often the case, much like the American Revolution didn't start out with the idea of forming an independent country. Independence is only declared more than a year into the Revolution. The Continental Congress tried very hard first to get the king to address their grievances so that they could remain loyal subjects of the king. It just didn't work out that way.
His main issue was with the practice of indulgences, the church's way of raising money by telling people they could buy their way into heaven. His complaints were ignored and things spiraled out of control.
So what was happening was they were building the new St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican, which is to this day the largest church in the world and is absolutely gorgeous. I was just there a month ago. Stunning, absolutely stunning to visit. So they're raising money to build that. And one of the ways they did that was the sale of indulgences. And specifically what you were doing is by giving money to the church, you were, in a sense, paying to lessen the time in purgatory for a loved one. Say Uncle Charlie is in purgatory for 20 years. You could get it down to where he could go to heaven right away, that kind of thing. That's an oversimplification of it, but that's basically the idea. And Martin Luther took a journey to Rome, and he was horrified by some of the stuff that he saw and the things that he saw as very real hypocrisy that was happening in the church. And one of the things, for example, with the indulgences that he says was, in these 95 Theses, well, if the Pope has the power to free people from purgatory, why wouldn't he do that out of Christian love and not just because somebody paid him to do it? Very legitimate question. So those are the kinds of things he's addressing.
Resulting in Luther's excommunication. Historians agree that the Theses were never nailed to the church door, particularly because Luther was a bit of a braggart, but he never claimed to have done this, only saying that he mailed them to the Archbishop. However, even if it had happened, it wouldn't have been the grandiose display that it was made out to be. Church doors were essentially the city bulletin board, and people nailed documents to them all.
Which is probably why people think it went down that way, because that was a good way to announce things.
Time so that they would be seen by most people. Lady Godiva's Ride. Lady Godiva was the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, in the 11th century. She felt pity for the peasants and the oppressive taxes her husband imposed on them, so she continually pleaded with him to lower their tax burden. Finally, sick of hearing her ask, Leofric told her that he would lower taxes if she rode through the streets naked on a horse. To his surprise, she agreed. Out of respect for Lady Godiva and what she was doing for them, all of the people of the city remained indoors during her ride except for one. That man, a tailor named Tom, gave us the expression Peeping Tom. The story is so iconic that it inspired multiple paintings and sculptures by
so supposedly this happened in the West Midlands. Is it Coventry? Is that where it happened?
famous artists, but there's actually no evidence that it ever happened.
No.
This story wasn't first recorded until over 2 centuries after her death, making it virtually impossible to have happened. Though Godiva and Leofric were real people, contemporary historians made no reference to Godiva other than her being married to an earl and her considerable donations to the church. If a famous naked ride took place, it seems like the sort of thing that they might have mentioned. Eureka! Archimedes was a Greek mathematician and scientist who was well known during his time. He was summoned by King Hero II of Syracuse to inspect a crown that had been commissioned. Hero had supplied the gold for the crown, but he wanted Archimedes to determine if the gold had been adulterated with cheaper metals like silver. The only caveat was that Archimedes could not damage the crown, which was likely in the shape of a wreath. Although this question would be easily answered if Archimedes knew the weight and volume of the crown, its highly irregular shape made calculating the volume a difficult problem. Archimedes went home to soak in the bath and think about the problem, and when he saw the water level in the bath rise as he sat down, he realized he could use the displacement of the water to measure the crown's volume. He then jumped out of the bath and ran naked through the streets yelling Eureka, excited that he could answer the king's question. While this story does appear in ancient historical accounts such as the work of Vitruvius, the story is still somewhat apocryphal. Archimedes certainly could have solved such a problem for King Hero, but running naked through the streets was likely a playful embellishment added by the historians. From a logical standpoint, he is also more likely to have used Archimedes' principle of buoyancy rather than the displacement of water, as the latter would have required measurements that were impractically precise given the technology at the time.
So let's talk about a couple of things here real quick, because this goes back to another thing that there were a lot of comments about from yesterday, which is this idea about the distance between when an event happened and when it's first written about, and whether or not that has anything to do with how true it is. And I would say this. Number one, when I mentioned yesterday about giving a side eye to accounts that happened after everybody's dead and gone, I was specifically talking about accounts that refute accounts that were written while those same people were alive. I'm not saying that if the first account we have of something is from 100 years after the event, that necessarily means that the event didn't happen. What that means is we just don't have earlier accounts, and there might have been earlier accounts. A lot of people are using the biblical example, and so obviously, again, speaking this through the lens of a Christian who believes in the truth of the Bible, and I'm not opening that to debate. That's a matter of faith, and it's not a matter I want to argue with anybody about. So, but here's the thing. If, for example, we had written accounts that we know were written during the time of, say, King David, and then we had written accounts 500 years after King David that directly conflicted with those accounts written during the time of King David, then I would say, you know what, I think I'm going to give a side eye to the ones from 500 years later that changed the story compared to the ones that were written during that time. I used that as an example in talking about modern history, where people write history about, say, an event in World War I during the lifetime of the people involved, and then someone comes along after all of those people are dead and gone and says, I have all new evidence that completely refutes all of that stuff. That's what I have a problem with. If we have a story that's written, for example, 200 years after a historic event, but we don't have any earlier sources than that, then it's more of a gray area, because there may have been earlier sources that those accounts are based on that we just don't have copies of anymore. So I wouldn't immediately discount something just because we don't have contemporary sources that write about it. I would more likely discount something if later sources add things or take away things or change things from the story compared to versions that were written during that time. I hope that all makes sense. All right.
Mes Death Ray. There are many apocryphal stories about Archimedes, but the other most famous one involves the siege of Syracuse.
Mythbusters did this.
War. During the siege, it was said that Archimedes used a series of large mirrors to focus the light from the sun onto oncoming Roman ships, setting them ablaze while they were still in the water. This has been referred to both as Archimedes' heat ray and his death ray. It's a popular story that lines up with people's belief about the brilliant inventor. However, the earliest references to this death ray came 4 centuries after the war. Even then, it was only stated that Archimedes set fire to the boats, and the author didn't specify how. Still, the theory seemed somewhat plausible, and numerous attempts have been made to create this event using only materials that would have been available at the time. Despite the best efforts of Mythbusters and other teams trying to recreate Archimedes' invention, they have been universally unsuccessful. Even though it's theoretically possible that it could work, the logistics of aiming the mirrors perfectly at a moving target make it incredibly unlikely that this really happened. Archimedes was killed during the siege by the Romans, so if he did have some clever way to make his death ray work, then the plans died with him. William Tell's apple. Everyone has heard the famous story of William Tell and the apple, but for the people of Switzerland, it's much more than that. The legend goes that after refusing to remove his hat, the tyrannical Habsburg bailiff Albrecht Gessler ordered Tell to shoot an apple off of his son's head at a distance of 120 paces. If he failed, they would both be put to death. Tell loaded his crossbow, counted out 120 paces, and then fired, taking the apple clear off of his son's head. When Gessler asked why there was a second arrow in his jacket, Tell said that if he killed his son, he would have killed Gessler next. This is the part most people know. But the story goes on from there, with Tell being imprisoned, escaping, assassinating Gessler, and helping lead the rebellion that led to the formation of the Old Swiss Confederacy. Naturally, Tell became a national hero, but there's one problem. Not only is this story a complete fabrication, there's no evidence that Tell actually even existed. The first account of this story was written hundreds of years after it happened, and the author got the date wrong by 16 years. If that wasn't damning enough, another story written over 300 years...
That's a pretty minor thing for me, though, if the date's off by 16 years, hundreds of years after the events. I can excuse that if everything else lined up.
Before this allegedly took place, it was written by King Harold Bluetooth of Denmark and a man named Palnatoke. It's nearly the exact same story, with Palnatoke and Bluetooth taking the roles of Tell and Gessler. Death by ham sandwich. Cass Elliot, also known as Mama Cass, was a beloved member of the 1960s group The Mamas and the Papas, as well as an accomplished solo artist. And the story goes that she died choking on a ham sandwich. It's such a well-known tale that it was even joked about in Austin Powers. However, while we know that this was not Cass's true cause of death, it wasn't a total fabrication. When Dr. Anthony Greenberg saw Cass's body in the room where she had died, his first instinct was that she died of asphyxiation. He noted that she'd been lying down while eating a ham sandwich and drinking a Coke, which he deemed a dangerous activity, especially for someone overweight.
So this is a great example of how some of these stories get started. The reason we know the details in this case is because it's so recent. So we know exactly where that happened and how it kind of diverged into that conversation. And this gives us a little bit of insight into things from centuries ago. Things like the Lady Godiva story. That didn't come completely out of thin air. Somebody didn't just sit down one day and say, you know what, I'm going to make up this story about a woman riding naked through the streets. Somewhere, something happened along the way that led them to write that story down. Doesn't mean it happened, but it means that where there's smoke, there was fire in this case.
His initial analysis was that she had choked to death from the sandwich. The public immediately latched onto this story because it was deemed a humorous cause of death. Cass's weight had made her the constant butt of people's jokes, and this fit the narrative that they had constructed around her perfectly. So much so that few people took notice when her actual cause of death was revealed after her autopsy.
And this is an unfortunate reality, and I see that it mentions there Keith Moon from The Who, the drummer, did die in the exact same bedroom. That is a fact, at the same age. So this leads to something I think that has happened a lot lately, and it's probably always happened, but I think we've noticed it more lately because of social media, is that if people put out something that is a lie and it spreads quickly before the facts are known to refute it, then by the time the truth comes out, everybody accepts the lie because it's what they've been hearing all along. And this happens a lot in the media. I can think of a lot of examples that I won't mention now because a lot of them deal with politics. But people throw stuff out there, everybody buys it, and even when the truth is known, nobody cares because they've already believed the lie.
Though it was related to her weight, Cass did not die choking on a sandwich. She had been consistently overweight, but also routinely went on dangerous crash diets to lose weight for photo shoots and the like. The combination of these crash diets and being generally overweight put a tremendous amount of strain on her body, and she died of a heart attack. She just happened to coincidentally be eating a ham sandwich when that happened. The original vampire. Prince of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, is often referred to as the world's first vampire. While vampire legends predated Vlad, vampires obviously aren't real, whereas Vlad was, allowing him to earn this title. Vlad was a brutal and ruthless leader, known for impaling his enemies on spikes. He is often cited as drinking the blood of his enemies as well, with the somewhat toned-down version of the story being that he would walk among the impaled bodies while eating dinner, dipping his bread in their blood.
So, another example of where the idea of vampires, obviously we know that they're not real, but the idea of people drinking the blood of their enemies or drinking someone's blood, that absolutely does happen. So depending on your definition of what a vampire is.
Since Vlad was such a feared ruler and was famous for his cruelty and brutality, it's easy to see how this rumor would have spread. Even if it wasn't true, it would certainly be to his benefit if everyone believed it. Modern historians have always questioned how realistic this story was, with it being dismissed as legend and hyperbole. However, new research may have provided a definitive and somewhat shocking answer. According to the study published in 2023, Vlad definitively did not drink any blood, human or animal. In fact, he was probably a vegetarian. Skin and saliva samples were taken from a letter written by Vlad, and expert analysis showed a complete lack of animal proteins. This would only be possible if Vlad was a vegetarian or possibly even vegan. Of course,
assuming that Vlad was the guy who wrote the letter and that it was his saliva on it.
That surprising fact doesn't
no
make
way
him
to know
any
that.
less brutal. Oscar Wilde's last words. Oscar Wilde was impoverished and in poor health for his last few years. The end of his life was spent confined to his bed in room 16 in the Hôtel d'Alsace in Saint-Amand-de-Pré, Paris, before he finally died from meningitis. On his deathbed, it's said that Wilde spoke his final words to a friend, author and journalist Claire de Prats. "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go." It's a good line.
Listen, it's fantastic last words, but, you know, whether it happened or not, still really cool. There have been some people who have had some fantastic last words.
And complaining about the aesthetics of his dreary hotel room while dying certainly seemed to fit Wilde's personality. Last words are notoriously difficult to verify. However, this story is most likely only a slight exaggeration. Prats wrote that Wilde spoke these words to her, but not on his deathbed. Instead, she said that he made this remark weeks before his death during one of his final trips outside his hotel room. So while it is likely that Wilde said the famous quote attributed to him, the idea of them being his last words were a later embellishment to make the story more interesting.
This is a great point here concerning the idea of last words. A lot of times you'll see things attributed to people as their last words, and they were in fact spoken by those people, and they may have even been spoken by those people on their deathbed. But when we say last words, what we mean are really the last thing they said. And sometimes they may have said a few things after that. And in this case, the source, who definitively can say he said it to me weeks before, should end any controversy about that one.
The Betsy Ross flag. The original first American flag, featuring 13 stars and stripes, is often referred to as the Betsy Ross flag in honor of its creator. Elizabeth Ross was a Philadelphia seamstress who had sewn flags during the American Revolution and in the decades that followed, and she was personally commissioned by George Washington to create the design for the first official United States flag. This is an iconic story about the founding of the United States, and Betsy Ross sewing the original flag was even immortalized on a US stamp. However, virtually every part of this story is fiction. Betsy Ross really did spend 50 years sewing flags, mostly for the military, but there's no evidence she designed the so-called Betsy Ross flag. Even if she had, it was actually the second official flag rather than the first.
I've never heard anyone claim she designed the flag. Maybe people have claimed that. I haven't heard that. My understanding was always that in the versions of the story that I heard was that she was the one who sewed the flag, not that she necessarily was the one who planned it and designed it.
The original story, as told by a family, was that Washington had a sketch of the design that he wanted, and that Ross's only design contribution was to switch from 6-pointed stars to 5-pointed stars, as they'd be easier to manufacture. This evolved over time into her designing the entire flag. While her grandson may have believed the more humble family lore he presented of Ross only changing the shape of the stars, most people spreading this story knew that it was entirely fictional. But when her grandson came forward with the story, it was just after the Civil War leading up to the nation's centennial celebration. There was a strong desire to create wholesome American lore that could help unite the nation, so the story was publicized with no regard given to its veracity. Burned at the stake. The Salem witch trials are a well-known part of American history.
This is another one of those ones that sometimes, you ever notice that sometimes with these stories, you constantly hear people refuting it, but you never hear people actually saying the thing that's being refuted? I've never heard anyone say that Salem the Salem witches, or the people convicted of witchcraft in Salem, were burned at the stake. I've never heard anyone say that, but I constantly see people refuting that idea that they were burned at the stake. This is one of those examples of methinks you doth protest too much. You know, we're arguing against a fact that nobody is stating.
In every Halloween, nearly 1 million tourists come to see the city where it all went down and make traffic miserable for everybody else. It began when 2 young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began experiencing fits symptomatic of bewitchment. They named the witches, who they believed to be casting spells on them, and the witches were burned at the stake. This set off a cascade of events in which dozens of innocent people were executed after being accused of witchcraft by young girls. While this is how most people remember it, it's not exactly what happened.
I don't think it is how most people remember it. I don't know. People tell me in the comments, have you ever been told that witches were burned at the stake in Salem, in Massachusetts in 1692? Not that witches were burned at the stake, because they definitely were in Europe in centuries before that. But specific to this story, have you ever heard that? I thought everybody understood that they were hanged.
Most of these events didn't actually take place in modern-day Salem. The trials were primarily held in Salem town, which is now Salem, but the people involved were all in Salem village, which is present-day Danvers. More importantly, nobody was burned at the stake. This mistake is likely the result of confusion more than anything else. Witch trials occurred throughout Europe as well, and in Europe it was customary for the witches to be burnt. In Salem, however...
And not just witches, but it was a punishment typical for women in general. So, for example, when Anne Boleyn was sentenced to death, the second wife of Henry VIII, her original sentence would have been to be burned at the stake, but it was commuted to a simple beheading. So a lot of women who were convicted of crimes besides just witchcraft could have been burned at the stake.
The standard method of execution was hanging. Of course, this ultimately worked out better for the town of Salem. Burning the victims wouldn't have left any meaningful landmarks, but Gallows Hill is now a popular stop for tourists. War of the Worlds. On October the 30th, 1938, CBS Radio decided to air a very special Halloween broadcast. Live on air, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre were going to read a radio dramatization of H.G. Wells's famous novel War of the Worlds. The show was written in the style of a news broadcast, so it opened with a disclaimer that what was being presented was a fictional radio play rather than a breaking news bulletin. However, not everybody caught that announcement. The fake newscast was airing alongside the Chase and Sanborn Hour, a popular show that had only become more of a hit with the addition of ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie McCarthy. Because ventriloquism apparently translates amazingly well to radio.
Yeah,
After
right?
the first comedy sketch, there was a musical number, and many listeners changed stations to CBS, having missed the initial disclaimer. This resulted in widespread panic. Depending on how much of the show people heard before losing their they believed either there was a major natural disaster, an invasion from the Germans, or an actual Martian invasion. That's how newspapers reported it anyway. But it was all a lie. Radio news had been rapidly gaining popularity, and it was stealing advertising revenue from print newspapers. In an ironic twist of fate, the newspapers decided to use the fictional news drama to paint radio news as untrustworthy by knowingly printing their own lies. Newton and the Apple. Isaac Newton was enjoying a peaceful day in his garden.
So see, I was just, yesterday when I meant to say Newton and said Einstein instead, I was just predicting ahead of time that Isaac Newton would be mentioned later.
Theop Manor in Lincolnshire, England. As he sat beneath an apple tree, an apple fell off the tree and landed directly on his head. The sudden impact turned Newton's thoughts to that of gravitation, an attractive force that pulled things down toward the Earth. It's a well-known story, though even children assume that it's apocryphal when they hear it. The idea that Newton's laws were derived merely by being bonked on the head with an apple sounds too preposterous to be true. However, it's not actually that far off the real story. The story dates back to a biography biography of Newton that had been written by one of his friends, and the story about the apple was
So,
told...
written by one of his friends. This is somebody who knew Newton, who would have been familiar with Newton's stories and his science and things like that. So that does give some credibility to it.
To him directly by Newton. Though he never claimed that the apple hit him on the head, an apple was indeed the inspiration for his work with gravity. Rather than being struck by the apple, Newton merely observed an apple fall within his line of sight. It got him wondering why an apple falling from a tree would always fall straight down towards the earth rather than at an angle or even instead of falling upwards. The idea of an apple falling up obviously sounded ludicrous, but without Newton explaining how gravity worked, there was no real scientific explanation as to why. Battle of Thermopylae. Everyone knows the story of the
300, yes.
It was one of the most famous battles of ancient times and was immortalized in the comic book and subsequent movie 300. During the battle, 300 Spartans stood alone against a Persian army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Persians would have to travel through the bottlenecked pass of Thermopylae, effectively negating their numbers advantage. The battle lasted for 3 days until the Spartans were dead to the last man, but with 20,000 Persian deaths, Xerxes decided to withdraw his army rather than pressing onward to engage a larger Spartan army. It's an incredible story that demonstrates both the skill of Spartan soldiers and the importance of battle tactics, but while the basic idea of the story is true, it is a complete exaggeration.
Yeah, the basic idea in that there were 300 Spartans, just there weren't only 300 Spartans.
Herodotus recorded the battle as having
Herodotus, let's just say right up front, okay, if he told the story, there's a good chance it's not accurate.
4,000 Greek deaths, something that would be impossible if there were only 300 men there at the start. A Greek army of roughly 7,000 men fought against the Persians for 2 full days. After the second day, Leonidas learned that the Persians had found an alternate path and were moving to flank them, so he dismissed much of the Greek army.
And you see on this map there too that
the Persians
the Persians
alternate path and were moving to flank them.
When they outflank, which I mean the basic timeline of the story is pretty accurate as far as what we understand happened. They did get around behind them, and that's how they ultimately defeated them. But they did have men up there guarding that pass just in case. But there were thousands of Greeks. Even on the last day when a lot of them left, there were still a couple of thousand of them there. I think they were Thespians, I want to say. And Leonidas was like 60 years old when this happened, not young, fit Gerard Butler.
So he dismissed much of the Greek army. Though only 300 Spartans remained for the final day of the battle, another 2,000 Greek soldiers stayed as well. The Greeks also didn't all fight to their deaths, as it was reported that most of the 400 Thebans eventually surrendered to the Persian army. It was still impressive that the Greek army was able to hold the position successfully as long as they did, but the story has been exaggerated over time to depict the Spartans as effectively superhuman.
They also didn't dress like that.
Chastity belts. We can all imagine the scene so vividly. It's the Middle Ages, and you start to get frisky with some comely lass. But as you lift up her frock, you suddenly find yourself face to face with a chastity belt, padlocked shut by either her father to prevent premarital sex or her husband to prevent infidelity while he's off at war. It looks like you're going to have to settle for another night of medieval hand stuff. It's an extremely common depiction that has existed for centuries, and it's entirely fictional. The idea that chastity belts were common in the Middle Ages seems to have taken hold in the 18th and 19th centuries. Not because there was any evidence that they exist,
but they have one in Robin Hood Men in Tights. Men in Tights. It has to be true, right?
Just because the idea of a chastity belt made their ancestors seem backwards and repressed, making them come off as much more enlightened by comparison. While some references to chastity belts exist from the Middle Ages, they are exceedingly rare. Any references that do exist are either metaphorical or satirical in nature, and there are no actual chastity belts from the time period that have ever been found.
That's a great point, that last part. We can probably get around the idea that we don't have a lot of references to it, and we do have a few, but they're maybe satirical. But the fact that we don't really have any that exist today from a time period in which we have a lot of other things that do exist today, that says something.
The earliest known sketch of one of these devices is from a book written in 1405, which at first suggests that they may have existed. However, this book also has sketches of devices to make the wearer invisible and is filled with fart jokes. So it's hard to believe that this
That's kind of awesome,
wasn't
actually.
Also just a joke. Atlantis. The lost city of Atlantis was a utopian society located on an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, whatever that means. They were an advanced naval empire controlling
the Pillars of Hercules, there's a good chance that means the Strait of Gibraltar, right? I mean, on either side I'm pretty sure that's what that refers to.
All western portions of the known world. Then, after a failed attempt to conquer Athens, the Atlanteans fell out of favor with the gods and their island was cast into the sea. Most people understand that this was fiction, but some of the nuance has caused a lot of confusion.
But again, this could be something that's understood to be fiction that has some basis somewhere in some truth. What that is,
there are still those that believe Atlantis was a real place and have dedicated their lives to finding it. To those people, we wish them the best of luck in their endeavor. But as for those of us who are aware there was never an Atlantis, how important this piece of fiction was often gets misunderstood. Despite its fame and notoriety, the story of Atlantis was a relatively minor aspect of 2 books written by Plato. There was not some rich oral tradition about this lost city, nor was Atlantis a major part of the public consciousness at the time. It was simply an allegory that Plato invented to try and prove a point, though exactly what his point was remains a matter of considerable debate. Dr. Seuss.
All right, we're going to wrap it up right there. So as I said before, if you have something to add, please do so in the comment section below. If there's something I might have missed or maybe misspoke about, as often is the case, I am a very flawed person who regularly says things that I don't mean and things like that without even realizing it. So always check the comment section, look for a pinned comment if there is a correction that I need to make. If not, maybe I got it all right after all. And please check out Stories of the Great War, my latest video on the 38th Welsh Division. Very proud of how that one came out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.